Watch debut films from choreographers Jack Ferver and Omari Wiles as part of All Arts Dance Film Festival, Past, Present, Future, streaming free on the All Arts app and at allarts.org/past-present-future. Hi dance friends. I'm Margaret Fuhrer, editor and producer of the Dance Edit newsletter and podcast. And I'm here this week with such a wonderful interview episode for you all, our latest episode in partnership with the Kennedy Center. Our guests are the world-renowned choreographers and performers Akram Khan and Malavika Sarukkai. Both Akram and Malavika have roots in classical Indian dance traditions, Malavika in Bharatanatyam and Akram primarily in Kathak. And both make art that considers how to bring what is inherited into the present, how the classical can speak to the contemporary, and vice versa. Malavika is actually coming to the Kennedy Center quite soon. She'll perform her work River Sutra as part of its RiverRun festival next week. Akram's company is currently touring his production Jungle Book Reimagined. That will be at London's Sadler's Wells Theatre, April 4th to 15th. I felt very lucky to be able to get these two celebrated and extremely busy artists on a Zoom call, a global Zoom call with Akram in London and Malavika in India. Initially, this was going to be a moderated conversation with me in the middle asking questions, but by about 2 minutes in, it became clear that I was superfluous, that the two of them had such a beautiful rapport they'd be better off without me. So this is pretty much the last you'll hear of my voice until the end of the episode. Just a little context first. Our session together began with me asking them how they got to know each other. That was, it turned out, the only prompt they needed. And then I also wanted to mention that Malavika recently met Akram and his mother in person, and you'll hear that come up early in the conversation. Here they are.
Well, just to say that I've heard of Malika's name for years before I met her. A kind of a living legend, really, and also not in a kind of typical superficial way, but in a profound way. She's a superstar of Bharatanatyam, whether we like it or there's no other word to describe it. She was performing in the very venues that I would go and want to be part of, in the venues in Europe. So there was this extraordinary following of her work that I came across many fans and people within the industry who spoke so much about her. But I discovered her, unfortunately, quite late in my career. So sometimes when that happens, it feels like, that when you see the person, the experience is not as good as what was said. And actually, it was the opposite of what happened. I was like, they underplayed it all this time. When you actually experience it, I saw a piece that she did about River Ganges, and it's just very rarely Pina is one of them, Peter Brook is another, Aryan Mushkin is another artist, Malavika Dee is another, where you experience a show and you don't know, you don't have the words. So people would asking me after the South Bank, it was at South Bank, and they were asking me how did you feel, what did you experience, and it was very hard for me to put it into words because it hits you in the guts. It's very experiential. Dance is very profound work. It doesn't go to the head necessarily. It's not devised to go to the head. It goes deep into your body. And that's what I felt when I experienced the work for the first time.
I think, Akram, I think you've been far too kind and far too gracious and generous in the way you've sort of expressed yourself. But thank you for responding and letting me know what you think, because I think for an artist to an artist, and I think that's what happened when I met you in India this time last year, November. Somehow I had the feeling that when I met Akram, though I've seen him rarely on stage because in India, I mean, I live here and we don't get so many of your productions touring this part of the world. But I just felt that there was an instant connect, and it was sort of so strange. I couldn't quite figure it out. And I said, I felt I knew Akram even from before. though it was really the first time we were sitting and talking a little bit about dance. So I think there was a kind of a direct connect to the artist, to the person, and to, I think what I felt was the experience of what dance is for Akram. Though we didn't speak about it, but I felt it. I felt it. And that was very moving, because then it's like, oh my God, I've known him for so long. I haven't met him in person that many times. I haven't seen so much of his work. I've seen some part of his work. But I think artists are speaking another language. Like he said, it's of the heart. And it's really not much of the mind. The mind can come in later, but mind is not the focus. And I think this, what he also said about experiential, and I think that is dance. We all have these different forms. I mean, it could be contemporary, it could be classical language, etc. But, that's only the exterior. That's only the language on top. Actually, it's energy, it's life breath, it's emotion. And seeing him, and I think his mother as well, and I can't but stop to speak of her. Again, I felt I knew her. I don't know, Akram, what happened, but I just felt there was an immediate sort of, I don't know, affection, fondness, but respect. And I think it was her love for dance. And that was so important, because I was very close to my mother, and I lost her 10 years ago. And then I found this person, his mother, who had this abundant graciousness and love for dance. And I think I haven't met so many people like that. But, obviously Akram, coming back to his dance, he's a name, he's a superstar. I don't know what else we call you, Akram. Call you many things. But it's fascinating and rewarding to see what he has done from where he started and what he has made of his dance and his language that he speaks. It's another world. And I was so happy to have met him in person and spoken and, dance. It was fabulous.
Thank you.
I think if it wasn't for my mother, I might not have danced. It wasn't my calling. It was her calling. And I was very, very young. I was very small, little. And I didn't know. But somehow she took me and she put me in dance school, and I started training. But when I was 16, I realized that dance was my life. By the time I had made this decision, I don't know how, but I think what propelled me towards finding dance was because in the world I saw around me when I was 14, 15, it was troubled. It was very uneven. And dance was a kind of sanctuary I went into. It was my space. It was my little paradise. It was where adults didn't come in, which is my magical world. And so I sort of went into dance in that way. And at 16, I decided I wanted to dance. But my mother was the supporter. She was the pillar in my life. She was my, what shall I say? She didn't teach me dance, but she did almost everything else. She was my creative collaborator. She was my spiritual guide. She was my critique. She was the person I could talk to. I could, invite into my rehearsals. She managed my dance, my schedules. She traveled with me. She did my lights. I mean, it was just impossible. She did everything. And she was also my mother. So I had this phenomenal person with a fierce spirit and devotion to dance. And dance was primary. I came second. I happened to dance, but dance for her was her life. And I think that was an amazing relationship we shared. Yeah. So without her, I don't know, no dance, but with her, so much happened. Yeah.
And when you were young, was she your teacher, dance teacher?
No.
No. Okay.
But she came to all my dance lessons and she took my practice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. She was very particular. She didn't bother whether I studied or not. She was not interested in academic pursuit at all. But she was interested whether I practiced. So yeah, she was a different kind of mother. And yours, Akram, how was that for you?
I think in many ways a little bit similar. I would say there is a real sense of when no one believed, she believed. And I think that belief is a pressure, and that pressure is a privilege to have. People misunderstand pressure sometimes. When somebody imposes pressure on you or gives you pressure, it's because they see something in you, they believe in something in you more than you can see it because you're not ready to see it. And my mother was a literature expert. So I grew up as a child because my grandfather was a genius mathematician, and he was 2 times gold medalist of India. And so being a woman, being the daughter of this male kind of legend, the society really shunned her and said, well, she's not going to be academic or a mathematics genius. And funnily enough, she had 7 brothers, but none of the 7 were mathematical. Nobody was a mathematical genius. But out of, not revenge, but out of a kind of defiance, she said, I don't want to do maths. I don't want to be compared all my life to my father. I love stories. And that's how she got into dance. And so as a child, she used to tell me every night Greek mythology, Hindu mythology, from Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Chinese mythology, African mythology. She just collected like a hunter-gatherer. And then every night she would share. But the problem came later when I was a teenager, and a late teenager, and I was going to university. And then I started to get into arguments with so many people. And it was a very frustrating time at university for me because the version I had of all the mythologies and all the stories were different to their version. Because the story of Adam and Eve was told by my mother through the lens of Eve. The story of Mahabharata was told through the lens of Amba or Draupadi, or the story of Prophet Muhammad was told through the story of the wives. The story of Jesus was told through the lens of Mary Magdalene. So the version was, an experience was completely different. So I grew up with only female lens. And I don't, still today, she hasn't told me why she, did that. Was there a strategy? Was there but she did say to me that if you love something, you will constantly question it. And you will constantly see different facets of it. Because the moment you take it for granted, the moment you accept it, you don't love it anymore. You feel you're above it. Never do that. Constantly question it, because that means you're still learning from it. So she was very instrumental in literature, I would say, to me. I wish she would follow me, but she was a school teacher, so she stayed mostly in London, and I would go on travel and perform.
But I think there's an interesting, similarity, because my mother was also interested in, in philosophy and literature and poetry. So that was also something. I grew up in an environment which were these kind of conversations happening anywhere, at the dining table, when in my dance practice, sometime when we're going out, even if you're doing mundane things like, just at an office waiting for a passport. We found we were talking about these other dimensions to dance. And, when I hear you, when you said your mother tells stories, my mother too always shared what she had read. If there was something interesting, whether I understood it or not, she would at least tell me about it. So I think sometimes, somewhere, it kind of filtered in. And, I think it's also about, temperament of what you allow in and what you kind of observe from the world, what you actually take inside. And I think this was important. And very, very critical to dance was, she said, it's not a form of entertainment. It is a creative expression of the self. And that I heard when I was very little. And it it grew with me. And I think it hugely influenced the way I would later create work, or, the concepts I choose. And it really shifted things for me. I think we were just lucky to have mothers like this, just to have them around and be influenced by them.
Absolutely. I mean, there was one thing I was going to mention, was the reason I mentioned your name with Pina Bausch's name and Arjen Mushkin and Peter Brook. The reason I remember those is not just experiential, but because something changed in me. And my mother told me that's what art can do, profound art, deep art. It can change people. And I always say change happens in 4 different seasons. The first one is people change when they hurt enough that they have to. Secondly, people change when they see enough that they are inspired to. Thirdly, people change when they learn enough that they want to. And the fourth one is people change when they receive enough that they are able to. So in dancing, you feel that you're in the process of change. Something is changing every day. And perhaps for a moment, if it connects with one audience, it will also change them profoundly. So yes, it's not entertainment for sure. I completely agree that it's not that entertainment is bad. I learned so much from popular culture. And I think the intention is slightly different, or quite different. That's all. I think people misunderstand when artists like yourself or myself, or when we say that we're interested in art and profound immersion of work. It doesn't mean that Charlie Chaplin is not profound. It's just that he's in a medium and an area which is much more popular, let's say. Much more accessible.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt, but Charlie Chaplin is so profound.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, he's extraordinary. I mean, the stylization he brings into that work, I mean, that's what really, it just takes it beyond what it is.
Absolutely.
And to bring the tragic to in laughter, I mean, to just be able to, manage those two emotions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary. I think, when I say entertainment, I think I should clarify it because, coming from, the repertoire that we inherited, which was primarily court repertoire, which is say 200-300 years old, the traditional, shall we say, repertoire that I as a dancer inherited. And the way it is seen and presented these days, there is a certain sense of status quo. There's a certain sense of, let's keep it this way. This works. There's a certain sense of saying it works in the patriarchal world. Male poets wrote love songs. Hereditary women dancers danced it. They danced it in the courts of kings. It was all wonderful. It all made sense at that point in time. And I think for me, it has been about questioning tradition, questioning this very repertoire, and saying, am I looking at it as tradition or change, or tradition and change? And I've always seen it as tradition and change.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Many years ago, it was, I think I must have been in my 20s or so, when looking and practicing it for about 10, 20 years, I started feeling uncomfortable, restless, in this place I was put and the expectations of my dance. And then it became the dance, Bharatanatyam, this language, is not a style, it's a language. And why are we confining it to being a style? So I've been a bit of an outlier, I think, pushing, extending because I love the form. I love the classical structure, the grammar, the stories. And I think that's where I'm coming in when I say entertainment, because we are allowing dance. And I think that's, for me, it's difficult to expect so little of dance. I can't. I demand much more of myself through dance. And when I demand, I say, oh my God, so what am I going to do? What do I create? How do I create? what else do I say? Do I stay with love songs only because that was what I inherited? Or can I move on? It's a seeking because I love the classical so much. When I say classical, I mean the certain vocabulary, movement vocabulary, etc., that we're using, gesture language, etc. I respect it. So I need to question it.
It's really interesting because Malika, I being born and brought up in the West, at the time I didn't quite realize being a teenager, but as I grew up into my, I would say pretty late in my early 40s, that's when I started to look back and realize that a shift had happened. And it's a hard thing to talk about how in the industry that we're in, the global industry, there was a shift, I think, in the early 2000s, and it continued to shift where all classical forms like Indian classical dance and African dance, they were sidelined. And what was put in front was the notion and concept of abstract or contemporary dance.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt it was happening, but I didn't quite, my brain took time to catch up and to make sense of what was happening. And Maven, of course, is my younger brother and a devotee of you, and a beautiful Bharatanatyam artist. And he was in the classical world, and I was in the contemporary world. And it's interesting because in the Western industry, he struggled a lot that time,
Right.
because he was really immersed in the classical form.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was interested in the contemporary form, but the classical was very personal to me. So I only trained every morning in classical. So that was my starting point. And I still have to train every morning. But that was my grounding. That was my anchor. But because I happened to just swim in the contemporary world, I could see that there was really, looking at Maven, there was a really pushing away of him and making him feel that the classical form is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And this disturbed me hugely. So I started asking questions. Who are the ones who are the gatekeepers of the industry? Who are the observers? Who are the ones that are watching? Who are the ones that are going to come in to watch the performance? And I started to realize there was a kind of it's so subtle, but also it's very clear. There was a kind of colonial approach to the industry. It's a sense of colonization. How do we do it? We take away all your stories and we just abstract it so it could entertain us. We could call it contemporary. And thank God Pino Bausch was around, and artists like that, or Trisha Brown, who, made really interesting work, deep work. Otherwise, I would have completely dislodged myself from the contemporary dance world because it felt like a place which was an experimental space, but without soul. The shift of trying to take away the stories and the colors and the emotions from Indian classical dance and say, well, look, just give me the form. We'll present it to our audience that we can understand it. So I was like, who are the we? And predominantly it was for the white people because they didn't want to feel stupid, because they didn't understand the nuance and the stories. And that was very problematic for me later. I started to realize there was a real sense of something racial happening here, something colonial happening here within the contemporary industry. I'm sure there will be backlash when I say these things, but it's because I'm in the contemporary dance world, I feel I can say that. The value of classical Indian dance, the value of traditional forms like African, it's so important. And I think there was a difference in how we saw time. In contemporary, we only look to the future. And I think this is a generational thing that's happening more and more. My children or my children's generation don't want to look to the past. They think everything in the past is wrong. In Indian classical tradition, in African tradition, time, there is no past and there is no future, there is no present. It is a deep, long ocean time. And with contemporary dances, everything behind me is gone. So I'm not interested. But in order to, I always say, in order to understand where you're going, you have to understand where you came from.
Absolutely.
Do you,
Absolutely.
how do you feel in the industry, if you don't mind me asking?
Not at all. I think you made such important observations, which comes through your experience of having performed and, to various audiences and or globally. I think this idea of the colonial kind of mindset, which chooses to see something and puts away some part of it. I think actually, to live the cause with classical dance, I think any serious artist practicing a classical form from whichever part of India they come, or Africa, anything which is more profound, which has another depth to it. Yes, is you feel actually all your life you're trying to swim upstream. There is so much resistance, and resistance against reaching out. And I think it's easy. And I think another point is, I think people prefer to be conditioned and think less generally than to feel. Now, when an art form, a profound, in whichever way, is it contemporary, classical, whatever, if dance is profound, if that is the expression of dance, it demands that you feel. You have to give more of yourself. The artist has to give much more of herself, himself, but the audience also has to give of themselves. They have to be vulnerable. Now, if we don't want that, right? I'm just thinking aloud. It's almost like we're masked. That we say, you know what, we're conditioned, we like to accept only this part. So don't give us any more. This is fine. You remain in that part. And so actually, dance is such a marathon, as you would agree with me. And with classical dance, it's a fierce battle to stay the ground, to just hold on and say, you know what, this matters to me. And this is what I'm going to express. And this is my language. So don't mess with me. Expect me to do what you want to see. Because guess what? I am immersed in dance. I live it. I live a life in dance. And this is what I want to dance. So I think in the industry, as you said, it's really difficult for classical dance to sort of retain its flavor, and to retain soul. To dance with soul is like you have to give of yourself. You've got to understand immersion every day of your life. It's not immersion in, oh, this performance I'll immerse, then I will go out. No, you're drowned in it. It's a passion. You have to live it with that fire. And you need something deep inside you. I think as individual artists, you need that something deep inside which holds you, which stabilizes you against all these storms and all these kind of things you're expected, not expected, to say, you know what, this is my compass, this is my route. And also one more thing, I just like to add that with classical, in working with, a more traditional sort of structure, etc., we perform the same pieces over decades, right? We don't just say, okay, this is done 5 years of this, so we don't do it. And then it requires even more give to it to say, how do I live the moment when I've danced it so many times, so many hours? What is it that I find within me to give? Can I surrender to the dance? It becomes so almost like it's asking so many questions of the individual and the intimacy of that conversation.
Yeah, the words that you're saying, though, intimacy, surrender, immersion. I think there is because I'm traveling so much, meeting young people, I feel there is a real shift in how they approach and their relationship to dance. Maven and I were going through a series of auditions. It was really interesting, some of the questions that came up. The question is, what time does your day finish? Or do you also work on Saturdays? So I thought, wow, the entry point into
Right.
their relationship to dance is a job.
Mm-hmm.
It's a job. And in the past, the question would be, why don't you work on a Sunday?
Ah.
And that entry point is very clear that it's different
Mm-hmm.
to the entry point of another dancer who asks, what are my hours? All the words that you used, immersion, surrender, do these things, obsession, these are kind of dirty words now.
I feel, Akram, just hearing you, and I think it's perhaps, you hear these questions because, you have the company and you're auditioning and you have these big productions happening. But somewhere I feel that, overall, the world has become much more transactional, much more transactional. I mean, that's the world we live in. And then, when you think of dance, you say, oh my God, that's why you need dance even more. Because you're living in a world which is so transactional, you need to go and give yourself up, unmask yourself and say, give yourself up to dance and or to life. I've always felt that wonderment is a word we're losing.
Mm.
And I think dance in its deepest form takes us to that moment of vastness. It's like seeing the night sky. I mean, it is like knowing that you are a little speck in this universe. And that's the celebration, to know you're a speck. And actually, you have the universe in front of you. I think wonderment as an emotion is something we don't allow in our lives, perhaps because we think more. Now we're all used to thinking. And I say,
Yes.
Can we just feel? Can we feel?
We were talking about this in India, Malika. We were talking about where does Indian classical dance fit in the industry? And I kept using the phrase, it's now become an endangered species. And so it's even more important to have artists like Malavika to constantly remind this young generation the power of dance.
I saw this little thing, a little writing on a tree up in the mountain somewhere, which said, this was once a seed that held its ground. And what you saw was this huge, beautiful, magnificent tree. And I think back to that and say, oh my God, we need to hold our ground. We need to be rooted. We need to have that identity. We need to say, who are we really? What do we dance? Why do we dance what we dance? Profound art and profound dance. It is contemporary because it lives in the moment. If it lives in the moment, you can't call it past. It's now. It's here. It's with us. It's this. And I think, and that's what one is trying to share with people. This has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. So grateful. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Malika. Thank you so much.
You.
A big thank you to Akram and Malavika for their generosity with their time and insights. In the show notes, we have links with more information about Malavika's upcoming performances at the Kennedy Center and about Akram Khan Company's upcoming performances at Sadler's Wells. So please be sure to check those out. And thanks as always to all of you for listening. We'll be back next week with a headline rundown episode discussing the dance world's recent news stories. Until then, keep learning, keep advocating, and keep dancing.